Welcome back to ASBR Boxing. I am delighted to be joined by Elliott and Owen, and we are here for a discussion hot off the press. Artur Beterbiev moved to 20-0 with 20 knockouts over Callum Smith. So why not, we thought, discuss some fantasy fights that we would love to have seen Artur Beterbiev in over the years. Of course, we're going to talk about three fights. None of them, unfortunately, will ever happen. Of these three fighters we mentioned. Well, I was going to say are all retired, but one is making a return, I believe, in 2024. But yeah, of course, we'll come to each. I'll come to each of you, and I don't want to give them all away at the top of the video. But yeah, lads, I'm looking forward to dissecting these fantasy fights with you. So we may as well get straight into it. So Artur Beterbiev, obviously unified light heavyweight champion here. How about a name that I'm going to throw out that Owen suggested? When we were kind of talking about this fight, and talking about this video. How, here's a fantasy fight for you: Artur Beterbiev against Bernard Hopkins. How does that one go, Owen? Make your case of how you think that one goes, and just generally your thoughts on that fight.
Firstly, thank you for having me back on. I love these videos because there's no right, there's no wrong answer, but it's always great to see differing opinions. I think stylistically, it's an unbelievable fight. Bernard Hopkins, an unbelievable defensive fighter, master of the dark arts. Self-proclaimed himself. His longevity of his career was due to mastering the fundamentals of boxing. Against just a freak of nature in Artur Beterbiev. I was in a few videos in the build-up to fight week for Beterbiev Smith. I think Beterbiev he's just a freak of nature in terms of what he brings, what he does. Look, he's a pressure fighter, but he's so calm, collected. He's clever with his shot selection. He forces the pace. So I think styles make fights, as cliche as it is, but it works perfect for this one, in my opinion. You've got a forward, fast pace, heavy puncher against someone who's excellent defensively. If it comes into a clinch, you'd probably favour Bernard Hopkins if it comes to that, because he's so good on the inside, again, master of the dark arts. So I think stylistically, it was the first fight that popped into my head, because I like to think, when I look at these fantasy fights, how would they match up? 'Cause it's easy to put two names together, but then although they might be all-time greats, it might not make for the best sort of nights of action. But I just think you get Beterbiev coming forward, throwing bombs, and you'd get Bernard, who again, known as the executioner, great knockout percentage throughout his career, fighting on the back foot, looking to get that shot that no one has ever found against Beterbiev. So yeah, I think stylistically it's an incredible matchup.
Completely agree, mate. And something you said there, I'm just going to throw straight to Elliott now. Obviously, Hopkins so defensively sound, as Owen correctly mentioned there, particularly in his prime. And whether or not, a lot of people have different opinions, was his prime middleweight, super middleweight, or even light heavyweight, that's down to you to decide. But how do you think, how does that battle go for you, Elliott? A defensively sound fighter like Bernard Hopkins against such an economical fighter in Beterbiev, who literally wastes nothing and punches like a mule as well.
I think Owen and yourself have hit the nail on the head there. It's a case of someone so defensively sound versus someone who's obviously going to be sticking the pressure on it immediately. And I think for me, the interesting one, you talk about records as well, but Bernard Hopkins, 65 fights, but was only stopped once. His very, very last fight against Joe Smith. So it's not really, you can't really take that into consideration. Obviously, he was long past his best at that point. But, he's been in there obviously with the likes of Kovalev before that, didn't manage to stop him. A range of champions across the divisions. You mentioned obviously middleweight up through to light heavy. Jermaine Taylor, names of that nature, Chad Dawson, Pascal. None of them managed to obviously stop him. He managed to obviously beat those guys as well. So for me, I just the real thing when I was thinking about this when Owen suggested this was, could Beterbiev stop Bernard Hopkins? That is the thing I genuinely think. Like, could he actually get to him and stop him? Like, it's hard for me to say yes to that question because he's obviously so defensively sound. But equally, I don't see Bernard Hopkins. Like, he obviously had a reasonable knockout percentage, but I don't see him necessarily having the power to stop Beterbiev and keep him off him. Frankly, like we saw that with what happened with obviously Callum Smith and people talking about his power. This was almost inexistent, and other guys, that have obviously fought him as well, haven't had the power to keep him off him. So I think Beterbiev would win the fight. I have to say that, but I genuinely wonder whether he actually manages to stop him late. And it almost seems sacrilege to say that, given obviously Ben Hopkins' record, his championship record as well, and is obviously the fact he only got stopped once in his last fight. But I genuinely think there's a chance he could stop him.
Interesting, mate. Really, really interesting. I think I kind of agree with something you've said there. I do think I could actually see that fight going to points, believe it or not, despite both big knockout ratios. Regardless of who I think wins that, I actually could see that going 12 rounds just with styles. And yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I genuinely don't know how I would see that fight. I can see reasons why Hopkins wins it, particularly a prime Bernard Hopkins. But then I can also make a case for Beterbiev being too strong and potentially even getting to Hopkins down the stretch. But who knows? We'll come on to at the very end of the video. We'll kind of give our who we think Beterbiev has a best chance of beating out of the three, and maybe ranking them in order. But with time of the essence, we'll move on to our next fighter. One that I think Elliott, you were keen to discuss, is a potential matchup, which I want to put it out there, it's going to actually happen with the big man making his return. I highly doubt it, but we're of course talking about Sergey Kovalev. How do you see an Artur Beterbiev and Sergey Kovalev fight going, Elliott? And make a case for why that would be such a great fight.
Well, mate, I think the King, obviously, as you said, the King is back, but I also feel like there's just violence in this fight, frankly. And I think like you look at there's a bit of obviously crossover in the names we're going to mention. I'm not going to give away the third name either prematurely, but there's crossover in the fact that Kovalev fought Hopkins, beat Hopkins. Not that I'm necessarily saying he's necessarily a better fighter. Maybe just his day it was a UD victory over Hopkins. But there's other names on that record. Again, the likes of Pascal, and even coming through. Obviously recently he obviously had that loss to Canelo. But I think we'll obviously also accept that that was obviously after another fight against Anthony Yarde that was quite recent. Not necessarily it was a quick turnaround. Obviously he's had other issues outside the ring potentially that explain that. But I think the reason I mention that is obviously you look at that straight away and go, well, he's been stopped by someone who's really a super middleweight / middleweight. So Beterbiev should just run through him. But I don't necessarily believe that's the case. I think we've seen with Kovalev, very, very good jab, very solid jab, which you'd need against Beterbiev, frankly, to keep him off, and a very high KO percentage record as well, 29 KOs and 35 victories. So carries power. How do I think the fight would go? I think to be honest with me, mate, I think it wouldn't obviously go 12 rounds. I think it'd be both guys kind of forward. The question for me is, could Kovalev keep him off with that jab? Gave Ward problems, obviously, with it. Or would Beterbiev manage to get round it and put the stoppage on him? And to be honest with you, as much as it hurts me to say this, because like I said, the King is back, I just can't see anything other than Beterbiev stopping Kovalev. But I think it'd be a hell of a fight, frankly. And, if it does happen, fantastic. I'd still like to see it, even though I think it'd be career shortening and possibly life shortening for Kovalev if it were to happen now.
I think, what, I was so happy when you mentioned that name because it's just pure violence, as you said, all Russian affair as well, of course. You look at Kovalev and, he was a massive puncher, like in his heyday, in his prime at 175 pounds. Huge, huge puncher. But I would have, and I'm saying this with confidence, I would heavily favour Beterbiev. Prime v Prime, I would heavily back Artur Beterbiev to win that fight. I'm going to say something, I don't know whether you just maybe agree, but obviously 4 defeats on the record of Kovalev, 3 of which were stoppages. The only one was obviously that wasn't a stoppage was the first Ward fight. But I'm not saying Andre Ward's not a big puncher. He's obviously unbelievable, world-class elite fighter. But like I've just think when Ward stopped him that second fight, I think he just showed that Kovalev's chinny. So I think that's not a good matchup with the punching power and accuracy and timing of Beterbiev. So I would have backed the Beterbiev knockout. What about yourself, Owen? Are you making it 3 for 3 for Beterbiev, or do you think Kovalev could have won that fight in his prime?
I'm gonna have to back my boy Beterbiev. I think stylistically, out the 3, Kovalev is the perfect matchup for Beterbiev. I just think, like Elliott said, hit the nail on the head. Whilst it lasts, it would be pure violence. I think that's the way sort of an earlier Kovalev, who, as you rightly said, Paul, was a big puncher. and doesn't really get the credit for the sort of the run before we've seen him, where he's past his best now. The recent losses he's had, he doesn't get the credit for being as big a puncher as he was. But I think Joe Smith and Anthony Yard both sort of paved the way of how not to fight Artur Beterbiev, where especially Joe Smith Jr., where if you try and meet fire with fire, you will lose, you will get burnt. It's as simple as that. And I think for this, it's a great for the fans, although it may not necessarily pass for like the casual boxing fan. It may not be the biggest sort of seller, even though it should be. I think that it'd just be pure violence, but I would have to back Beterbiev. And to be honest, I don't think I could see it going past 6 or 7 rounds. I think Kovalev would try and meet him in the middle early, and it'd just pave the way for Beterbiev to find the stoppage. But like Elliott says, whilst it lasted, I think it'd just be pure sort of almost like not necessarily head to head, but almost phone box style fighting, just trading with each other. And I think Beterbiev has definitely got the better chin out of the two, and also a bigger puncher.
Yeah, mate, really, really interesting. Wish we had have got that fight, but unfortunately we won't. Last but by no means least, and I'm going to admit that this next potential fantasy fight is with Andre Ward, who is one of the main reasons that I got into boxing when I did. However many years ago that is now. Andre Ward is what a fighter, son of God, 32-0, 16 KOs. You look at the run that he went on and some of the names that he beat. Like he beat a prime Carl Froch, beat a prime Arthur Abraham, and Mikhail Kessler. There are just a few. Then obviously moved up to light heavyweight. Had 2 fights there. Beat Kovalev first time around. Contentious, some say. Got off the deck to win that via decision, and then in the rematch beat Kovalev via 8th round stoppage. So yeah, I love this fight. It was kind of a few people were mentioning it on our Twitter feed the other day as to how this Beterbiev against Ward fight would go. I, for one, think Andre Ward wins. I don't know whether you agree. I just think that he can adapt to kind of any style, no matter what. And I'm going to say that I think he would beat Artur Beterbiev on points. Tell me why I'm wrong or right. Owen, you first.
I think this one for me, this is the one when the names were popped up that we decided before the video. This is the one I've had the biggest headache with, because I feel if Andre Ward had have had, it sounds mental to say it, but if he had had a bit better marketing, his PR had been a bit heavier, and he'd have continued for maybe sort of 3 or 4 fights, I feel we would be talking about him more of an all-timer. I feel like for hardcore boxing fans, when you ask sort of stylistically who's the best to watch, etc., Andre Ward will pop up in the odd suggestion, but I just don't think he got the credit for what he deserved. I think, like you say, Paul, he adjusted to fight so well. He read his opponents like a book. When he fought Prime Cal Froch, it was a relatively easy night's work, which is crazy to say. For me, it's really tough because I do take into consideration Kovalev dropping Andre Ward. So it was a toss-up, but it's a 51-49 on the fence, but I do think Beterbiev may, if he could drop him, I think Beterbiev would find the stoppage very late on. So I would edge it. However, if Andre Ward would win on points, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was the most difficult for me as well as you, and probably Elliott as well. I think like Andre Ward's record speaks for itself. So yeah, Elliott, what do you think? Who do you think? Who do you give the advantage of here? And yeah, what are your general thoughts on that fantasy fight?
Well, before I get into the answer, I just want to say to everyone watching that it's no surprise. If anyone's actually tuned in also to this video and to Paul Kelly's white collar, you'll see that obviously the Andre Ward influence runs deep there, in Paul Kelly's fighting style. But I think Paul, you actually hit the nail on the head when we introduced this video. When it's talking about like weights as well, and that's the real complicating factor for me here. Like even though like physically there's not much in reach or height, I think there's only like an inch in height and an inch in reach between Beterbiev and Ward. It's the fact, obviously, Ward at super middle had that fantastic run, didn't he? And then obviously Beterbiev's campaigned more light heavy, which for me maybe swing it. But to me, this is hard. I'm with Owen. I'm actually fully with Owen. I literally am 51, maybe 49, 51, 49. I think Beterbiev may get it, but I don't think he'd stop him. I think he might even get a decision. But I think either one could get a decision. based on where it is. So for me, this is the closest one. But I'm not going to bet against King Arthur, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to go with Artur Beterbiev possibly on points.
Interesting, very interesting. We could talk at length about these three fights. There's obviously more fighters that you could probably mention. Roy Jones Jr. potentially how that fight would go against Beterbiev, and loads of other different fighters around the light heavyweight division. But just before we finish, guys, just want you to give me the three names in order of who do you think Artur Beterbiev had the best chance of beating and the worst chance of beating. So let's say at number one, you're confident who he beats, and number three, you're not so confident. Elliott, throwing it back to you.
Yeah, Kovalev, I think would be his easiest, and then I think quite a big gap though between that, and then two Hopkins, and then three Ward for me.
What about you, and do you agree?
I think it's going to be a full house here, but yeah, definitely, I do agree. I think it's quite a big gap between Kovalev and Hopkins, but then I think Hopkins and Ward, it's less of a gap, but I do think Ward would definitely be his toughest night.
Me too. That's three out of three. I completely agree with that order. Guys, let us know your thoughts on who you think would be the easiest and most difficult fight out of those three for Artur Beterbiev. Again, obviously, fantasy fights. Do you agree with what any of us have said? Do you completely disagree? Are there other fights that you would have loved to see Artur Beterbiev in? Fortunately, that's all we've got time for, but I really enjoyed that one, chaps. Elliott, Owen, thanks very much for joining me, and I'll speak to you again soon.